Good afternoon. I'm Matthew Spaulding, Associate Vice President and Dean for Hillsdale College here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. Most of you know what we try to do here in Washington, D.C. as a college is to teach. And one of the most important things to teach in this town especially is to teach people who want to learn about statecraft and the art of statesmanship. The best way to do that is to study great statesmen, which we do in our classes, and we do in our activities and retreats we do for members of Congress on a regular basis. And we have a guest here today who's going to talk about that, some of the two of the greatest of those statesmen and what we could learn from them. He's one of our professors, one of our fine professors who I know quite well. To introduce our speaker today, a student, Emily Runge, will be introducing him. She is a junior politics major back at the home campus in Hillsdale. She's currently interning on our WHIP program in the Asian Studies Center of the Heritage Foundation. On campus, she's a George Washington Fellow. She's a student assistant in the President's Office. She's with the Pi Beta Phi sorority. And after graduation, she's going to consider going abroad to teach for a year before she goes on to graduate school. So, Emily, if you'd like to introduce Professor Morrisey.
Thank you, Dr. Spaulding. Dr. Will Morrisey holds the William and Patricia LaMothe Chair in the United States Constitution at Hillsdale College, where he has taught since 2000. Previously, he served as Executive Director of the Monmouth County, New Jersey Historical Commission, and as a legislative aide for the New Jersey State Senator Thomas Gagliano. Morrisey received his BA from Kenyon College and his MA and PhD from the New School for Social Research, where he received the Hannah Arendt Memorial Award in Politics for his dissertation on the political thought of the American presidents of the founding and Civil War periods. Morrisey is the author of 8 books on statesmanship and political philosophy, including Reflections on De Gaulle, The Self-Government, the American Theme, Presidents of the Founding and Civil War, The Dilemma of Progressivism, How Roosevelt, Taft, and Winston Reshaped the American Regime of Self-Government, and most recently, Churchill and De Gaulle, The Geopolitics of Liberty. His articles and books reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Times, the American Political Science Review, the Claremont Review of Books, and Interpretation, a journal of political philosophy, which he has served as an editor since 1979. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Will Morrisey.
Thanks for coming out today. And thank you, Emily, and thank you, Matt. What Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle can teach us about the world and what they taught their contemporaries was that there can be such a thing as a geopolitics of liberty. That isn't self-evidently so. Geopolitics is the realm of necessity. Politics is, or at least can be, the realm of liberty. Can statesmen really adjust the one to the other? Churchill and de Gaulle both thought so. And today I mean to show why they did and how they conceived of doing so. But first I need to define some terms, namely liberty, regime, states, and geopolitics. By liberty, I mean politics in Aristotle's strict sense of the word. Aristotle compares politics to the relationship in a household between a husband and a wife, a relationship of reciprocity, of shared rule, of ruling and being ruled in turn. He contrasts such kinds of this rule with such kinds of command and obey rule seen in the household, the rule of parents over children and of masters over slaves. The latter two forms of rule differ from each other in that the parents rule for the good of the children, whereas, of course, the masters rule for the good of the masters. But neither of these forms of rule rises to the level of political rule, which is the rule of persons obligated by consent to listen to one another, to deliberate together. Liberty in the political community consists of exactly such rule. Among the regimes possible in the polis, Kingship and aristocracy resemble parental rule, whereas tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy resemble masterly rule. His idea of democracy, of course, is that it's the many who are poor who are squeezing and tyrannizing the few who are rich. The republic, or mixed regime, so structured that the few who are rich and the many who are poor must listen to one another and win each other's consent to the laws they wish to enact, admits genuine political liberty. Republics exhibit political rule to the highest degree. So that's what I mean by liberty. What's a regime? It consists, and again I'm following Aristotle here, first of the rulers, the one, the few, the many, good or bad. Second, the institutions or forms the rulers frame in order to conduct the business of ruling. Third, the ways of life that ruling and being ruled foster in the citizens. And finally, the overall purpose of that way of life. So, for example, America, the purpose of the regime, as the Declaration of Independence says, is to secure the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A person who lives under tyrannical rule will live a life very different than the one who would live in a commercial republic. He will learn to love and to fear different things. His soul is likely to be permanently marked by those habitual loves and fears. Taken together, these four elements of the regime form the ethos or character of the people who live in the political community. Those who found new regimes or reform old ones take care to see that the rulers, ruling institutions, ways of life, and overall purpose of the community all reinforce one another, form a coherent whole. When you attack foreign regimes or defend your own regime against foreign attack, you must coordinate all of these elements in a sustained effort organized in the most desperate circumstances. As statesmen, Churchill and De Gaulle faced this question of regimes in exactly such circumstances. The modern commercial republics confronted the military oligarchies of Wilhelmine Germany and Austria-Hungary, then the tyrannies of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and then again, with nuclear weapons on both sides, the tyranny and eventually the oligarchy of the Soviet Union. In prevailing against these illiberal regimes, republics proved the defense of political liberty hard, but also possible. What's more, Churchill, De Gaulle, and the statesmen, politicians, and tyrants they encountered all acted in a world of massive, centralized modern states, the third term I want to define. By states, as distinguished from regimes, I mean political communities understood not in terms of who rules, but in terms of the size and the degree of centralization of the government structures. For example, whatever regime it may have, a polis, an ancient polis, is small and centralized. A feudal state, larger but decentralized. A modern state, large and centralized. An empire is very large, but often quite decentralized. The modern states Churchill and De Gaulle saw contended not only for territory, not only for rule over vast populations, they also contended with rival regimes and rival state forms. Some of these states had regimes that aimed not at self-defense or even regional hegemony, but at worldwide rule. Given enemies animated by such ambitions, defenders of the commercial republics needed to attend not only to regimes and states, but what had come to be called in their lifetimes geopolitics, the fourth term that I want to define. As the word implies, students of geopolitics overlay the boundaries of states and their regimes on the geography of the earth. The geography of one's own country amounts to a stubborn fact, changeable by military or demographic conquest, but not easily changed. Geography is nature without natural right. Natural right and political liberties that secure it must themselves be secured not only by regimes, but by policies that defend citizens by defending the key physical approaches to their territory. All men may be created equal, but all terrains are not. The Strait of Gibraltar, the mouth of the Mississippi River, the English Channel, such geographic choke points must figure in the military, political, and economic thinking of any nearby ruler. Although contemporaries, Churchill and De Gaulle faced different geopolitical circumstances. In the first half of the 20th century, the capital city of the British regime sat on a medium-sized island, but it ruled some 20% of the human race and roughly 25% of the land on Earth. Although it did not rule the seas with quite the authority it had enjoyed in the 19th century, it still had the best navy in the world. It had substantial material and technological resources to augment its well-settled regime of political liberty, and it needed them all in its two wars with Germany. France occupied a larger homeland, but ruled a much smaller empire, although equally far-flung. Its position was more vulnerable than that of Great Britain, with its capital city on the western section of the European plain, that vast flatland that extends from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ural Mountains in Russia. Although France's coastline offered superb access to major trade routes and imperial holdings, and while seas, oceans, and mountains give France security on most of its borders, it remains geographically open to invasion from the west, from whoever controls Germany. Now, this causes a political problem for France. It's not just a geopolitical problem. To defend their capital, the French need a substantial army. As every good Republican used to know, armies can threaten Republican regimes in a way that navies, for example, do not. Armies can stage coups d'etat against civilian government. French geography thus makes both the French state and French Republican more, as the French say, problématique. What about the geopolitical circumstances of the enemies of Great Britain and France? With the sole advantage of vastness, Russia, with its capital on the western section of the country, obviously faces the mirror image of France's dilemma, vulnerable not from the east, but from the west. Germany, the other 20th century enemy of Great Britain and France, found itself in a double bind, vulnerable from the east and from the west. Its political antidote to such vulnerability, Bismarckian state centralization under regimes of military oligarchy or of militant tyranny, led it into, not out of, the surrounding maelstrom. In addition to these enemies, Churchill and De Gaulle also saw the rise of a friendly but worrisome regime in North America, one which had never wielded the worldwide influence it partly fell into, but mostly intended and successfully planned. Whereas they could and did predict the conduct of Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union, these statesmen could not so easily anticipate American conduct. They very much would have liked to have guided it to any degree possible. They both needed, but to a degree dreaded, the United States and some of its policies, especially those arising from the Americans' long-standing hostility to European imperialism. British and French statesmen needed to bring all of these matters, regime, state, politics, technology, into coherent strategies of self-defense. Now, all three of the major enemy regimes, Wilhelmine Germany, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, enjoyed the military advantages that military oligarchy and tyranny often wield. A sustained program of military organization and procurement, in addition to the ability to prepare secretly and to strike suddenly. The enemy states also had large populations at their disposal, populations whose attention could be commanded by propaganda channeled through communications media the rulers controlled. To counter these advantages, Churchill and De Gaulle urged peace-loving, commercial Republican citizens to prepare militarily. They also sought alliances with regimes that shared their sense of these dangers and wanted to contain or eliminate them. These similarities notwithstanding, the two statesmen found themselves in rather different circumstances, geographically and politically, and proceeded accordingly. Now, protected on all sides by water, the British Isles in Churchill's time commanded the aforementioned worldwide empire, but this empire was not so compact as the Nazi and Soviet empires, not composed as theirs were of geographically contiguous territories. Therefore, Churchill's Navy-based strategy not only defended the home island, but also sought to keep extended and vulnerable supply and communications routes open. Because his country's most important enemies lived in Europe, Churchill could continue Great Britain's long-standing policy of offshore balancing, opposing each bidder for continental empire as it arose. This was then supplemented by occasional onshore balancing with land troops as needed. This was a strategy not of divide and rule, that was reserved for ruling the peoples within the empire, but of divide and deflect. This need for offshore balancing and also for alliances and for the maintenance of an overseas empire all explain Churchill's preference for military political strategies that emphasized encirclement, indirection, taking the end around, most famously his persistent attempts to get at Germany from the south, from the Dardanelles Straits. Now, politically, at home, Churchill enjoyed the advantage not only of a long-established imperial state, but a long stable regime that accustomed its people to a civic and political life, to the responsibilities of ruling and being ruled, which responsibilities in turn gave them reason to defend themselves and their regime against foreign oligarchs and tyrants. However, the regime had changed considerably in the past 100 years, moving from a mixed regime in which the monarch, titled aristocrats, and mercantile oligarchs shared authority with some of the middle classes, to a much more nearly democratic commercial republic in which every man and soon woman voted. How would that kind of commercial republic fare when confronted with hard foreign policy choices? Could it avoid the traditional isolationism of the conservatives and the anti-militarism of the liberals? Would the new socialists defend their country not only against their obvious foreign enemies on the right, but against the blandishments of the international left? This circumstance accounts for Churchill's voluminous writings, which amount to nothing less than a vast one-man effort to provide his countrymen with the sort of civic education that men of his class, the aristocracy, had had bred into them through the system of classical schools, which introduced students to the literature of the Greeks and Romans, a literature that in large measure is devoted to understanding politics. Churchill exhibits strong traces of Latinity, of Romanness in his very Anglo-Saxonism. If the people now voted but could not attend Harrow or Sandhurst, they could hear Churchill's speeches and read The World Crisis, The Life of Marlborough, The Second World War. Unlike books for scholarly audiences, Churchill's writings teach politics by telling stories. They are better than most popular novels. They present the history of England, of the English, as a vast working out of the questions of self-defense, civil freedom, and statism in a commercial republic. These writings could also find a readership in the vast commercial republic that shared the English language and the Atlantic Ocean with the British Navy and with British commercial shipping. Even if the empire could not be perpetuated, and of course in the end it could not, with a European confederation of commercial republican states, what Churchill called a United States of Europe. That could work best if prudential or statesman-like thinking of European Latinity could better inform the somewhat raw Americans, even as the Greeks had advised young Rome. The alliance could counter the empires of Germany, of the Germans and the Russians. In war and in peace, Churchill could foster an imperial and aristocratic view of the world without needing imperialism or aristocrats. That is, he could encourage the now sovereign peoples of Great Britain and the United States to think of their struggles with their enemies both in the long term, which is the way aristocrats think, and in the world as a whole, as imperialists think, conceiving of wars hot and cold as if they were one big battle fought on land, air, and sea, but above all fought for their own peoples and their own ways of life. De Gaulle had a different circumstance to consider. There was what he called the banal observation, but also a true one, that England was an island and France was not. The French must always worry about their neighbors to the east. This means that whether France inclines toward a regime of republicanism or one of monarchism, it will need an aristocratic or military element integrated into that regime. No purely commercial republicanism will do unless France could settle the German question, the Polish question, and the Russian question simultaneously. Because a substantial military can endanger any civilian regime, French politics featured a certain tension not seen in the more favorably circumstanced Great Britain and United States. Therefore, in a way, the main geopolitical problem de Gaulle faced rested squarely on the political problems at home, a problem more acute than that which Churchill faced. He saw this early and he never forgot it. France's political identity, its regime, were perennially controversial. Regime instability, factionalism, led not only to unsteady foreign policy, but to opportunities for exploitation by foreign enemies. De Gaulle proposed to solve the problem, the long-standing problem of regime politics in France, by retaining the republicanism that had settled in since 1870, but at the same time getting rid of parliamentarism by supplementing the French Assembly with a strong executive branch elected by the people as a whole. A president who could make decisions and stick with them, that was the only salvation for French republicanism internally and in its relations with the world. Parliamentary republicanism oscillated between too much talk with no action and brash, imprudent action. The founding soldier statesman of what would be the Fifth Republic thought his own character could provide a model for what France needed. In large measure, he was right about himself, although too optimistic about many of the French. To prepare this founding, de Gaulle could point to the nearby bad example, German moral and political extremism, the result of badly designed regimes animated by dangerous philosophic principles. Against this, and against the homegrown immoderation of French politics, de Gaulle could point to France's Latinity, the core of which was mesure, or moderation, the virtue which alone could begin to balance all of France's contending regime factions in one republic. Geopolitically, this republic could proceed by getting rid of its imperial holdings and turning to a limited rather than an expansionist nationalism, again in noticeable contrast to the Germans of the first half of the century and the Russians of the second half. By criticizing the non-Latin, non-Roman foreign regimes, de Gaulle could persuade his countrymen, or might persuade his countrymen, to begin to view their own vices as foreign and disastrous. Like Churchill, De Gaulle took his speeches as instances of civic education, calling himself a teacher, as his father had been. These comparable and contrasting circumstances can be seen in the two statesmen's account of the First World War. Churchill served in the British cabinet, understood the war as a crisis of political liberalism and of the moral principles that undergirded it. The crisis had two dimensions: the ruthlessness with which all sides now fought wars in which civilians participated in the war effort, manufacturing the technologically advanced weapons that made it possible to target those very populations, put into question the humanitarianism that had animated so much of the moral discourse of the past century. Also, the profound failure of human predictive powers, seen in the frustration of well-planned offensive strikes and the subsequent bogging down of the soldiers in defensive entrenchments, where they served as passive targets for machine gunners and long-range artillery barrages, wounded the confidence of men had had in foreseeable progress, which had been another moral and intellectual hallmark of the previous century. Geopolitically, however, the war was not at all unprecedented, resembling those that Great Britain had fought many times before. In this new contest with a continental tyrant, tyranny had the initiative because commercial republics seldom initiate wars. But the civilian control of the war seen in the republics entailed a long-term advantage. Those governments, Churchill writes, were not under moral awe of professional authority when it came to military decisions. Elected officials probed and sometimes countermanded the recommendations of the generals. The generals, knowing and accepting this authority, had reason to lay out their reasons for doing what they wanted to do. In other words, it was ruling and being ruled. It was a political relationship. Republicanism also attracted, as it happened, a key and, in the end, decisive ally, the United States, which could enter the war under the banner of defense of democracy, that is, under the banner of the very moral principles and political principles that the war called into question among Europeans. Meanwhile, the Bismarckian monarchy come military oligarchy of Germany consisted of adventurers who underestimated the republics. Narrowly military in outlook, the German rulers went to war with a weak alliance structure and eventually found themselves outgunned. But the republics botched the peace, effecting only a superficial regime change in Germany. They also failed to crush the new left-wing oligarchy that ruled Russia. With Germans still outnumbering the French on the continent, and with France, the principal battle site of the war, weakened and gun-shy, the Republican victory proved hollow. De Gaulle spent the war on the battlefield and in prison camps. After the war, he became the protege of a French hero, Marshal Philippe Pétain, a circumstance which advanced his career but required of him considerable circumspection when it came to public political commentary. He confined himself to a veiled political analysis of France presented as a military analysis of Germany in his book, La discorde chez l'ennemi, which my colleague Robert Eden at Hillsdale College has translated as The Enemy's House Divided. De Gaulle independently came to the same conclusion that Churchill had advanced concerning the German regime, considering it ill-designed, racked with factionalism, because a set of passionate ambitieux, intoxicated by ill-assimilated drafts of Nietzsche, competed for preeminence and eventually set up a military dictatorship. Such a regime only magnified the personal conflicts that occurred within its narrow circle. Germany's principal ally, Austria-Hungary, was too heterogeneous, a multicultural mess, an empire further deranged by the pressures of war instead of being united by them. This sharp discord sharp critique of the discord in the house of the enemy, gives de Gaulle the literary equivalent of a military cover for an equally stinging, if much shorter, assessment of the French and their regime. If the impatient, overactive, overreaching military oligarchs of Germany were stymied by being slowed down in trench warfare, the chattering, do-nothing French parliamentarians needed exactly the opposite. They needed energy and an appreciation for military mobility, coupled, he says, with the art of the real and of the possible. If the Germans were Faustian, in the beginning was the act. The French were Hamletian, that is, indecisive, living in a world of words. Thanks to cynical old Clemenceau and the military sobriety of Pétain and Joffre, the French outlasted the Germans. But no sooner did they win than they returned to parliamentarism and to the ways of life that made a second war possible. For de Gaulle, in contrast to Churchill, the aftermath of the Great War was less a story of a botched international order than of a faulty regime in France, a regime that prevented France from becoming the anchor of a stable order of nations in Europe. De Gaulle understood parliamentary republicanism as a regime lacking in one preeminent moral and political virtue: responsibility. Parliamentarians could hide behind numbers, blaming one another for their collective incapacity to act in defense of the country. Only a unitary executive whose words and actions could be scrutinized by the sovereign people could be held responsible, could think himself to be responsible for France. Without that, France became irresponsible. Germany rose again with a worse regime than ever. Now, the statesmanship of Churchill and de Gaulle in the Second World War, which both men regarded as the second phase of a 30 Years' War, is well known. Briefly, by his alliances with the United States and the Soviet Union, Churchill saved Great Britain's regime of liberty, but was forced to begin the devolution of its state, the empire, which he called the foundation of our greatness. To save Britain, he had to sacrifice Great Britain greatly. By contrast, de Gaulle gained much for France in the war, if only because France had lost almost everything at the beginning of it. What he did gain was crucial for France and for Europe, and very seldom understood in America. De Gaulle used the war to reconstitute the French state with a republican regime rather than one dominated by the Communist Party. Without de Gaulle's clandestine operations in France before D-Day, in the years when he was running a government in exile in London and Algiers, the only organized forces in France after Nazi defeat would have been the French Communist Party and the Allied armies, with the latter needing urgently to press on to Berlin. In the aftermath of that war, these now eminent statesmen faced a new enemy in a new kind of war, the Cold War. Cold War enemy of the regime of liberty, the Soviet Union, avoided German rashness. For his country, Churchill saw several ways to proceed simultaneously. As a naval power, the United Kingdom could collaborate with the United States to retain control of the North Atlantic sea lanes, which had proved his country's lifelines during the World Wars and would be the lifelines of NATO in the Cold War. He could also fight to retain what remained of the British imperial possessions in the Mediterranean from Gibraltar to the Suez Canal, a foundation of containing Germany and Russia in southern Europe. Partly in view of Soviet refusal to hold real elections in Poland after the war, Churchill adjusted his too generous wartime opinion of Stalin, recurring to his original perception of the regime dating from right around the time of its founding, that ideology, more than Russian national interests, drove Soviet policy. In this new war, there was still at least some need to drag the Americans in, a need that began to be accomplished at Fulton, Missouri with the Iron Curtain speech. The actual title of that speech, as you know, was The Sinews of Peace. And it only overstates matters some to say that in the Cold War, Churchill hoped the Americans would provide the sinews of peace, while he and his fellow British statesmen lent their brains to the operation. He saw hope also in the character of the very Soviet ideology that made the Soviets dangerous. It was, he judged, too unnatural, putting too severe strains upon human beings for it to survive for long. As the hold of both Soviet ideology and the regime weakened, détente could become possible. Now, neither Truman nor President Eisenhower retreated from Roosevelt's anti-imperialist position. Throughout his second administration, Churchill clung to Great Britain's remaining imperial holdings, but looking to the future, he also advocated redeploying British forces from the imperial territories to Europe in order to lessen NATO's reliance on the United States and its atomic weapons. He correctly foresaw that the new, much more powerful hydrogen bombs increased the chances for peace, and therefore eventual Soviet softening and international détente. Because unlike the Hiroshima-era bombs, the hydrogen bombs really could be used to destroy a large country in toto. Such a prospect sobered even the ideologues of the Kremlin. He put little stock in the United Nations organization, judging it at once too broad and too factionalized to be of much use in defending countries attacked by the Soviets and/or their allies. He wanted to supplement the UN with regional federations, the United States of Europe, which, for example, which would have had a much greater interest in responding promptly and prudently to local crises. For a United States of Europe to occur, Franco-German partnership was necessary first. With a European trade union, a European federation, and a NATO with increased European participation, all in hand, Churchill projected, the commercial republics of the West could defend themselves and prosper while waiting for the decline of the Soviet Empire. Now, de Gaulle's strategy bore some resemblance to this, but with a sharper edge and more insistent Eurocentrism. Because de Gaulle had decided to get rid of the French Empire, he didn't face Churchill's dilemma. In fact, he could deploy the principle of national self-determination against both imperialism, the Soviet Union, and hegemony, the United States. Inasmuch as both superpowers had made much of the imperialism of the Europeans, decolonization could counter that rhetoric and turn it against its sponsors. De Gaulle envisioned what he called Old Europe. Mr. Rumsfeld did not invent that word. He envisioned Old Europe as a moderating influence, a balancer between the two new worlds, as he called them, dominated by America and Russia. To achieve a renewal of Old Europe, de Gaulle needed first to refound French republicanism. This time he succeeded. Armed with real executive authority, de Gaulle could then conduct national foreign policies, nonetheless intending to advance the greater interests of the world as such, because based upon liberty, equality, fraternity, and a concomitant responsibility of each nation for itself. Self-government in the full sense of the word. Given this nationalism with a human face, de Gaulle never made France quite neutral in the Cold War, while at the same time often harshly exhibiting independence of judgment and action by formally, if not informally, withdrawing from NATO and by criticizing American leadership of the West on issues ranging from monetary policy to the conduct of the Vietnam War. But he too practiced a policy of containing the Soviets by reaching out to Maoist China diplomatically, and especially by his civilizational appeals to Latinity. He made that rapprochement with Germany with Konrad Adenauer in the 50s, and one of the bases of it was that Adenauer was a Rhinelander, Catholic Rhinelander. He could have him over to his home at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, not just meet him at the Élysée Palace. So out of NATO, but in collaboration with NATO, backed with an independent nuclear arsenal, de Gaulle was confident that he could face down any further Soviet poaching in Europe. Latinity had the advantage of reinforcing French cultural patriotism while distinguishing France in a wide range of countries from the countries of Christian and Orthodox, Christian, Protestant, and Orthodox heritage. Right? Protestant and Orthodox Christianity. Not coincidentally, Russia and the Anglo-Americans. This Latin core, which include Catholic southern Germany, could, he hoped, decisively influence his own version of a European federation. Not a United States of Europe in the sense of a federation with a sovereign center, but a federation more along the lines sketched by Montesquieu, a federation of self-governing republics. Such a federation could include Britain if it renounced its Atlanticism, that is, its special relationship with the United States and Canada. Meanwhile, the Latin inflection of the federation could link itself with South and Central America and to other former colonies of the French and Spanish empires in Africa and Asia. Churchill and de Gaulle repeatedly recurred to the classical and biblical core of the West as the touchstone for all their policies, while neither denigrating the wisdom seen in other civilizations nor imagining that a citizen of any country within the West should approach that civilization through any culture but his own initially. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Churchill told students at the University of Oslo, "He who has received a university training possesses a rich choice. He need never be inactive or bored. There is no reason for him to seek refuge in the clack and clatter of modern life. He need not be dependent on headlines, which give him something new every day. He has the wisdom of all time to drink from and to enjoy as long as he lives. Gradually, as I have passed through life, I have developed a strong feeling that a university training should not be too practical in its aims. Young people study at universities to achieve knowledge, not to learn a trade. We must all learn how to support ourselves, but we must also learn how to live. We need a lot of engineers in the modern world, but we do not want a world of modern engineers. We all enjoy freedom, freedom for all. This is the most vital question of the future. The accomplishment of Christian ethics in our daily life is the final and greatest word which has ever been said. Only on this basis can we reconcile the rights of the individual with the demands of society in a matter which alone can bring happiness and peace to humanity." Churchill died just before the students in the universities of the West began an assault on just this kind of education. De Gaulle did see that assault, and at its most virulent in the streets of Paris in May 1968, when students joined with workers in an attempt to overthrow the Fifth Republic. He faced down that challenge by offering concessions to the workers and splitting them from the students. But the students' antics disheartened him. He had hoped that the regime he had founded would influence the moral and political sensibilities of the first generation that came up in it. Quite the opposite. Later, he told his culture minister, the great novelist André Malraux, "The students' drama is not a drama of the university. It's a crisis of civilization. You see, there is something that cannot go on, the irresponsibility of intellect. Either that will stop or Western civilization will stop. Montesquieu would have told me something important, but when I have questioned our intellectuals, they have said things that were simply inconsequential." Now, stupidity can talk and say nothing. Intelligence cannot. You will see. The intellectuals must rediscover what they think. When Malraux observed, in 100 years' time, who will be able to tolerate the vocabulary of the academic left without laughing? alienation, structure, demystification, Malthusian forces, progressivism, consumer civilization. De Gaulle replied that I came to deliver France from the fantasies that hindered her from being France. Character is above all the ability to disregard insults or abandonment by one's own people. The classical education that had formed de Gaulle and Churchill fitted their souls for esteeming such character. Would subsequent generations, no longer so formed, even comprehend them? They might, if that kind of education really does address permanent aspects of human life, its nature, and the political regimes founded in light of that nature. Modish academic jargon will pass. The purpose of talks like these is to put such jargon aside and to consider statesmen attentive to the real as they understood themselves. Thanks for listening.
Stuart Reuter. In your talk, you didn't mention something I think is true, that Churchill and De Gaulle hated each other.
Oh, no. Actually, they didn't. They argued. These are two highly spirited men, right? What Plato calls the thumatic part of the soul is well exhibited in both of these gentlemen. They didn't hate each other, though. They argued primarily over this. They argued during the war over what de Gaulle regarded as British encroachments on French imperial possessions. De Gaulle had already seen that the French Empire was going downhill. He'd been posted in Syria in the early 30s. In one of his letters back home, he tells, I think it's his wife or one of his friends, we really haven't made much of an impression here. You know, this is not going to work. But he was never, and this was true in the Algerian crisis, which he fought, which he met in the first years of his tenure. He was never going to let an inch of French territory go without the consent of France. He would never do that. So if Churchill was trying to run troops through Syria or just through someplace during the war, de Gaulle would have a fit. And now,
my recollection, though, is that during the war, Churchill did his best to cut de Gaulle out of any decision-making.
That was Roosevelt. Roosevelt was the one who, Roosevelt really did detest de Gaulle. He thought de Gaulle was going to be another sort of military takeover type of guy, a Boulanger, or one of those fellows, you know, Napoleon III. And he didn't register de Gaulle's character. He met him, but he didn't, and he liked him for a little while, right during the meeting. But after that, he went right back to trying to cut de Gaulle down. He wanted to shape France's state borders and also regime after the war himself. If you recall, he wanted a part of France to become Wallonia, right? He had that scheme and several others that he wanted it to go back to parliamentarism, and of course de Gaulle didn't want that. Churchill, well, there's a famous anecdote with Churchill and de Gaulle. Churchill is ranting to one of his colleagues about de Gaulle, and then at the end, once he gets out of breath, he says, "Well, after all, he is a great man."
Well, given the paucity of classical education in our country today, and I guess that would hold true in our leadership as well, does it make you sort of pessimistic about statesmanship for this nation?
Well, it gives Hillsdale College something to do. No. Dr. Arnn will be here. Dr. Arnn will be here next week. He will teaching statecraft. I've taught a class on Churchill and De Gaulle at Hillsdale, and what I do is I let them be the teachers. In other words, they are my superiors in heart and mind, and therefore the students should really learn from their writings. I do this not only with Churchill and De Gaulle, but with people that I don't like very much. I have a course where we do 20th century founders, so I have them reading Lenin, right, The State and Revolution. I have them reading large swaths of Mein Kampf. I have them reading, here's a famous 20th century founder for you, the Ayatollah Khomeini. I have them read Islam and Revolution. Get it from them. You know, politicians lie retail, but they tell the truth wholesale most of the time. They kind of have to, you know, they're forced into it. So read them. They'll teach you, and then one of my colleagues, Professor Steve Smith, who's in the English department, was saying this about the Shakespeare plays too. If you think along with De Gaulle, or if you think along with someone like Churchill as he's unfolding his argument in the book, or in a Shakespeare play, you think along with the different characters and with the drama, with the argument and the action of the book. You learn how to think about these four elements, for example, the regimes, et cetera, the states, geopolitics. You learn how to think in these terms, and then you can't get lessons from them. You can't say, well, you know, here's what Churchill would say today for America. You can't get that, but you can get habits of mind that can give you at least a chance to start thinking in the way they thought, even if you're not as good at it as they are. No one was, by the way, so you shouldn't feel bad about that. They were,
Yeah, this is a little bit off the beaten path, but since we are talking geopolitical thinking, and since you're familiar with all of the characters involved with the Second World War, I'm wondering if you could explain to me a question that no one has ever been able to explain to me. Why did Hitler declare war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor? What was his thinking in doing that? What possible benefit would he have in Germany being at war with the United States?
I believe that, well, I don't know. You know, I mean, I don't know if there's any documentary evidence about that in his mind. I'm a little bit hesitant about trying to follow the convolutions of Adolf Hitler's thought. He certainly had an ally with Japan, right? And he was honoring his alliance with Japan, for one thing. And yeah, but he thought he needed that in that part of the world. He wanted to support the Japanese. He really did. He thought they were the Aryans of the Asians, and so he had profound sympathies for the Japanese. So the answer is I don't know. You know, I'm just guessing along with it. But it certainly was a tremendous error, wasn't it? It made that whole controversy, that terrible America, you know, the America Firsters versus Roosevelt, that bitter controversy, which had Herbert Hoover involved with that remarkable book that he wrote that just came out. You know, it was a bitter controversy. It certainly eased Roosevelt's ability to bring America in on the European side. Yeah. Right, that's another thing. See, he wants to knock out. He certainly wants the ability to knock out American shipping to the Allies, right? And that would that's another thing. He didn't quite learn the lesson of World War I in that regard.
Just one quick comment. He also thought of America as a mongrelized, debased country and didn't appreciate what we really were.
That's another thing. He certainly underestimated America, didn't he? And this is typical of the enemies of commercial republics generally and of America in particular. I mean, America is oddly underestimated to this day in some quarters. America has a lot behind it. Let me give you an example of that. This is one of my favorite examples for the students. Some of my former students will remember this one. look at the way America is. You've got this continent-wide republic. It has the biggest, richest swath of farm. This is a George Friedman Stratfor type of point, right? It has the richest farmland in the world sitting in the middle of it. And it has the huge interconnected river system that flows down to the Gulf of Mexico. Any country, as Friedman says, that has that is going to be huge. And the funny story with Nikita Khrushchev was that they took him up in a plane one time, because after all, he's a Russian from Ukraine. He knows his farmland, right? Why would you like to see our farmland, Premier Khrushchev? Why, duh, I would. And so they bring him up in the plane, and he's going along, and he can see. He has satellite images, but of course he can't really see the quality of the soil from a satellite image in those days, that kind of thing. And he knows his farmland. He's looking, and his eyes get bigger and bigger as the plane keeps on going. And for the first time, he could really see. I'm sure he remained confident that his system was vastly superior to the rotten capitalist system. But he sure did see the material strength of the United States on that day.
Well, my question, going back to Churchill and De Gaulle, is Churchill's writings are incredibly well-known in the English-speaking world. De Gaulle's much less so. What is there about De Gaulle that we should read, especially in English?
They're all in English now. I would say certainly that book, The Enemy's House Divided, which was his first book. I don't think that's ever been surpassed in a way as an analysis of the German military. I could be wrong, of course, but that's very good. For his basic political principles, The Edge of the Sword is his book on that. Short book, easy to read. And of course, his two memoirs, the War Memoirs, right, and 3 volumes, and then his incomplete Memoirs of Hope, which is about his really in some ways his greatest act, which was the founding of the Fifth French Republic. After all, France had been very unstable in terms of its regimes for a long time, and it's been pretty stable since he did that. That was an accomplishment that desperately needed to be done.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Morrisey. I sense I have a difficulty with connecting this sort of economic, I'm an economist, economic progress, material progress, and some kind of commercial republic that kind of dominates the world with the idea of statecraft. That these may be entirely different, and that somehow, economies don't fight each other, or, you know. So I'm having trouble connecting the economic paradigm with the political.
Well, don't forget, in Montesquieu and in the Americans too, they tend to say we need commerce, but we also need republicanism in order to countries, after all, that have commerce with one another, they've fought many times. I give you France and Germany. Republics have fought one another many times, but putting the two together is conducive to peace among those countries, among those types of regimes. So a statesman who is interested in increasing the peace in the world is likely to, if he's a commercial republican, is likely to want to encourage commercial republicanism elsewhere. And of course, as we all know, commercial republicanism has perennial enemies of one sort or another. We have plenty of them in the world today.